As a small boy, whenever I saw myself reflected in a large mirror, I felt all the horror of the wraith-like doubling or multiplication of reality. Mirrors, with their never-failing mimicry, their pursuit of each of my movements, their pantomime of the world, seemed eerie to me. If a mirror hangs in a room, I can no longer be alone there. Someone else is present. God created the forms of the mirror to show man that he is but a reflection, that all is vanity. This is why mirrors frighten us. The great Argentine poet and storyteller Jorge Luis Borges is a magician with words, a master of unique metaphysical fables. Often, at the center of his strange labyrinths, he comes face to face with himself.
When I went to Texas, I thought, why are people taking me seriously? Why on earth? Then I found out. Well, firstly, I was a South American. That made me something picturesque, almost into a Mexican, no? Then I was old. I was already old at the time. That was way back 1961 or 62. Now I would think of that as youth. At that time I didn't. People thought of it as no. Then poet and also blind. That made me into Homer or Milton. So that I had all those trick cards in my hand. You see, an old, blind, South American poet, that's quite impressive. Then I had to live up to that image.
Old age, this is the name that others give it, may prove a time of happiness. The animal is dead or nearly dead. Man and soul go on. I live among vague whitish shapes that are not darkness yet. All through my life, things were too many. To think, Democritus tore out his eyes. Time has been my Democritus. This growing dark is slow and brings no pain. It flows along an easy slope and is akin to eternity. My friends are faceless. Women are as they were years ago. One street corner is taken for another. On the pages of books, there are no letters. From south and east and west and north, roads coming together have led me to my secret center. These roads were footsteps and echoes, women, men, agonies. Now I can forget them. I reach my center, my algebra, and my key, my mirror. Soon I shall know who I am.
I knew that blindness was awaiting me at the end of the road, since my father died blind, my English grandmother died blind, my English great-grandfather also, so that I knew what lay in store for me. And as it didn't come suddenly, but very quietly, I began losing, well, shapes, colors, and so on. The first colors I lost were, strangely enough, the black and red. Then I was left with three other colors. I was left with green, with blue, and with yellow. But blue and yellow somehow blended, and for a time I was left with yellow, kind of a vivid yellow. That was the last color left me. And now I live in the center of a luminous, at this moment, grayish mist. My father gave me the free run of the library. I could read what I wanted. And then he said to me, if you're bored, then lay the book aside. Don't be taken in by the writer being famous or being modern or being ancient. No, read what you enjoy. And only read what you enjoy, because if not, whole thing is meaningless. But he gave me that very sound advice, and so I did, all through my life.
As a boy, I lived in Palermo, a shabby, run-down suburb of Buenos Aires. The world of the knife and guitar throve, I'm told, just around the corner. That was the Palermo of hoodlums called compadritos, who were famed for their knife fights. But this Palermo was only later to capture my imagination. The heroes who populated my days and gave a pleasant shiver to my nights were from the pages of Stevenson, Wells, Mark Twain, and the Arabian Nights. For years, I believed I'd grown up in a suburb of dangerous streets and showy sunsets. The truth is that I grew up in a garden behind a fence of iron palings and in that library of endless English books. This is, isn't it, the dream I dreamed and forgot just before daybreak?
Borges,
Sí.
¿Cómo eras de niño?
Un poco insufrible, me parece. Estaba leyendo todo el tiempo.
¿Leyendo?
Sí, me gustaba mucho leer. Bueno, los de la noche, Julio Verne, los de Wells.
¿Y jugabas?
Cuentos de hadas también. Y también jugábamos, claro, a las escondidas, sí, hay otros juegos, qué sé yo, vigilante y ladrón,
¿Con qué?
Y con otros chicos, sí, con mi hermana también, que era muy valiente, ella subía a la azotea, tenía miedo, pero había que seguirla. A lo alto del molino también subía ella, yo me daba miedo, la seguía ella. Y ahora no, ahora ella es tímida y yo soy, bueno, un poco menos tímido, pero siempre he sido tímido. Eso no importa, es tímido, no se las arregla, ¿no?
The light comes in and I awake. There he is. He starts by telling me his name, which is, of course, my own. I return to the slavery that's lasted more than 7 times 10 years. He thrusts his memory on me. He thrusts on me the petty drudgery of each day, the fact of dwelling in a body. I am his old nurse. He makes me wash his feet. He lies in wait for me in mirrors, in mahogany, in shop windows. He is in my steps, in my voice. I hate everything about him. I note with satisfaction that he can barely see. I'm inside a circular cell and the endless wall is closing in. Neither of us deceives the other, but both of us are lying. We know each other too well, inseparable brother. You drink the water from my cup and eat my bread. The door of suicide is open, but theologians hold that I'll be there in the far shadow of the other kingdom, waiting for myself.
I think I'm sick and tired of him. Every morning I wake up and there he is. And people were speaking to me about him, and I have to remember things, even to intone verses, to explain my writings, the writing I've forgotten. Or maybe I feel exhausted now and then. Well, I do my best to describe him in every line I write, since I'm unable to invent other characters. So I keep on describing him all the time and slightly disguising myself, very slightly only. The reader knows myself all the time. I can tell that. I don't know, I think of myself as a reader, as a dreamer, and off and on as a writer. Only off and on.
Borges tells one story, The Meeting, through the eyes of a boy of 10 or 11, who might have been himself many years ago. My cousin Lafineur took me to a barbecue that evening at a house called the Laurels, in one of those suburban towns lying just to the north that sloped down to the river. All the others were grown-ups. No one ruffled my shyness. No one paid any attention to me.
But I always know the beginning and the end, the goal, the starting point and the goal. That's all I know. And then I have to invent the rest for myself. But the starting point and the goal are given me by somebody or something, I don't know. That's beyond me, of course.
¿Todo bien?
Sí.
Estos cuchillos pertenecieron a gente que se hizo famosa solo por usarlos.
¿Está aquí el de Juan Moreira?
No. Pero este aquí perteneció a Juan Almada. Y este otro a Juan Almanza.
Usted me está haciendo trampas. Usted me está jodiendo, ¿sabe? Sí, me está haciendo trampa. Tranquilo, nada, usted me está haciendo trampa, ¿entendió? Me está haciendo... A mí esto no me lo hace nadie, ¿sabe? Vamos a arreglarlo de otra manera.
No. Lo que pasa es que yo tengo miedo.
Voy a batirme con usted. Y ahora mismo.
Armas acá no faltan. Y alcanza.
Me jugaba que Manico iba a elegir la espada.
Little did the men know that the fighters who once owned those knives, Juan Almada and Juan Almanza, had been rivals. For years they'd searched for each other, but they never met. Juan Almanza was killed by a stray bullet during some election brawl or other. The other man, I think, died a natural death in a hospital bed in Las Flores. Now their knives were meeting.
Este lugar es aparente.
Unused to fighting with knives, they began clumsily, almost as if they were afraid of hurting each other. They began by watching the blades, which no old-time knife fighter would have done, but later their eyes were on one another. Danger, in some way, was transfiguring them.
Suelten esa ferretería que los estorba y agárrense de veras.
Uriarte's hand shook as he gripped the knife, and the same with Duncan. It was as though after a long sleep, side by side in the cabinet, the knives were coming awake and taking over. Without ponchos to act as shields, they used their forearms to block each lunge of the knife. I had imagined the fight as a chaos of steel. Instead, I was able to follow it, or almost follow it, as if it were a game of chess.
¡Se están matando! ¡No lo dejen seguir!
¡Qué raro! Todo esto es como un sueño.
In the years that followed, I often thought that what my eyes had seen that night was really the end of another story, an older story. Even after their gauchos were dust, the knives, not their tools, the men, knew how to fight. Who knows whether these knives will meet again? Who knows whether the story ends here?
We were about a man called Dobles, and Dobles took us to see a cockfight in El Magro. It's a very exciting experience, especially for a nearsighted man like me, because the whole thing happens, well, it's quite close to you. Then they give you a newspaper in order to protect your trousers from the blood of the cocks, and the cocks enjoy it. They enjoy fighting, the real fighters. Well, they may be blind, and they go on fighting. There will not be a single feather left on them, and there they are, like some kind of red swan, still fighting. And generally, one of them is killed in a kind of frenzy, a military frenzy or heroic frenzy. They go on fighting and fighting, and they enjoy it thoroughly. That can hardly be said for the bull in a bullfight, too. I don't think he's enjoying it. He's lazy. He hasn't the ghost of a chance, while a cock has. A cock may kill the other and feel very happy about it. I knew that I would be a literary man, I mean, not in the actual sense of writing, perhaps, but that my life would be spent among books. Those books are very important and very, well, endearing things. I always thought of heaven as a library. I always thought of paradise as being a library, as being full of books, especially of English books, and of 19th century books, I should say. Large, red, bound volumes, not paperbacks, of course, known for modern rubbish.
In about 1937, I took my first regular full-time job, a very minor position in a branch of the municipal library, out in a drab and dreary part of town. At the library, we did very little work. The other men were only interested in horse racing, football, and smutty stories. The first day I worked honestly. On the next, some of my fellows took me aside.
Escúcheme, Borges. Yo pienso que usted está trabajando demasiado. Tiene que trabajar más tranquilo, más despacio, ¿me entiende? Con calma, así no hay apuro.
Pero mire que hay una cantidad de libros atrasadísimos.
Sí, pero no importa. Mire, usted, por ejemplo, hoy hace 85, mañana hace 120, pasado 140. Así, con calma, despacio. Tenemos todo el tiempo del mundo.
Pero mire, por ejemplo...
No, despacito, con calma. Con calma.
I worked at the library for about 9 years. They were 9 years of solid unhappiness. I would do all my library work in the first hour, and then steal away to the roof and pass the other 5 hours in reading or writing. It was there, while I was playing truant, that I wrote some of my earliest stories.
I was very clumsy when I began writing, and now I suppose I'm less clumsy. Now I try to write, well, very simple words, words that need not send the reader to a dictionary. And I also try to tell my stories as simply as I can. I don't want to intrude into what I'm writing. I want to, well, the writing, well, let's say the dream, I want the dream to have its way with me. I don't want to interfere with it.
Un silbido de la patria.
Desde luego, sí.
Yo estoy ahora a la orilla del Ródano.
Sí, me parece que sé lo que usted quiere decir.
¿Sí?
Sí, y yo estoy a orilla del río Charles, que separa a Boston de Cambridge, ¿no?
¿Cómo?
Y sin embargo nos hemos encontrado. Carlos, yo escribí ese cuento hace tiempo, pero yo no recuerdo cómo sigue.
Another exploration of the theme of the double comes in Borges's recent story, The Other, in which, as an old man in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in 1969, he finds himself suddenly sitting next to the priggish young Borges in Geneva in 1919.
Yo pensé, caramba, yo sentado alguna vez en un banco a orillas del Ródano y de esa reflexión no demasiado interesante salió el cuento que me dicen que salió bien. At old age, one knows one's limits. When I was a young man, I thought I could be Oliver Cromwell or Thomas Carlyle or so on at will. Now I know, well, I know my limits. I know, for example, well, I know I couldn't attempt to write a novel. I couldn't attempt to write an epic. I couldn't attempt to be a man of action. I'm a mere literary man, I mean, a reading man, a dreaming man, And now and then, alas, one writes. But I think of my fate as being essentially a literary one. And that's as rich a fate as any other.
Yo le digo a usted que tengo 83 años y no lo creo. Me parece imposible. Me siento, bueno, lleno de curiosidad, lleno de temor, como cuando era chico, como cuando era joven. ¿Qué?
Porque a lo mejor no hay diferencia entre el ayer y el hoy.
No, posiblemente no haya. Y además que si hubiera diferencia, seríamos otras personas. Tiene que haber algo esencial que perdure en nosotros y que se da cuenta, bueno, que hace que esos recuerdos que yo tuve de Ginebra sean míos y no sean de usted, por ejemplo.
Claro. ¿Cómo será el mundo suyo? Este mundo que yo tengo ahora a los 21 años es de una manera.
Beneath our conversation about people and random reading and our different tastes, I realized that we were unable to understand each other. We were too similar and too unalike. Each of us was a caricature copy of the other, yet unavoidably, it was his fate to become the person I am. We said goodbye without having once touched each other.
Every single story of mine has been a duty. I mean, that's been laid on me, a burden laid on me, and then I had, well, to do it, to fulfill it. I had to do it. But I always think of those things coming from somebody else, perhaps well, from my own past, or my own memory, or what it's called a great memory, the memory of the species in every individual.
Of all the men I ever knew, Ireneo Funes is the one who most haunts my memory. He was a country boy from a small town in Uruguay, the son of a woman who took in washing.
Ave María Purísima.
El pecado concebida. Adelante, pase nomás.
I only saw him 3 times, the last many years ago, on the day I called to say goodbye and to pick up the Latin text of Pliny's Natural History that I had lent him the week before.
Quae quis exegerit volumina in bibliothecis, legentis modo representavit, ars postremo eius rei facta, consumata a metrodoros sceptio.
Ireneo had been thrown by a half-wild horse belonging to the San Francisco ranch, and he now lay hopelessly paralyzed. When my cousin told me this, the news had an extraordinary effect.
Adelante.
The accident had been predicted by the events surrounding my first meeting with Funes 3 years before, but like the elements of a dream rearranged. I'd been galloping on a horse back to the San Francisco, and Funes had been running along a high, narrow place from which he could have fallen.
¿Qué horas son, Ireneo? Faltan 4 minutos para las 8, Juan Bernardo.
Funes, my cousin later explained, was famous in those parts for always knowing the exact time, like a clock. Now, his eyes fixed on the fig tree beyond the window or on some spider's web, Funes never moved from his cot. Every evening as the sun went down, he was carried to the window.
Antes que el azulejo me volteara, yo era como todos los cristianos. Un ciego, un abombao, un desmemoriado.
Pero vos siempre supiste la hora justa, ¿no?
$19 años viví como quien sueña. Miraba sin ver, oía sin oír. Me olvidaba de todo, o de casi todo. Al caer, perdí el conocimiento. Cuando lo recobré, el presente era casi intolerable, de tan rico, tan nítido.
The rest of us, with a single glance, see 3 glasses on a table. Funes, when he looks, sees the glasses and overhead each and every tendril, each cluster, each individual fruit of the entire grapevine. In his memory, he had engraved the shape of each cloud in the southern sky at daybreak on the 30th of April, 1882, and he could compare them with the cover of a certain book bound in leather that he had seen only once, and with the outlines of the foam raised by an oar dripping into the Rio Negro on the eve of the Quebracho uprising.
Yo solo tengo más recuerdos que los que habrán tenido todos los hombres, desde que el mundo es mundo. Mi memoria, Señor, es como vaciadero de basuras.
He told me that the year before he had devised an original system of numbering. Each of his numbers was a different image. In just a few days, he had gone beyond the 24,000 mark.
7013, 7014, 7015, 7016, 7017, 7018.
Pero esas voces inconexas son lo contrario de un sistema de numeración. Decir 365 es decir 3 centenas, 6 decenas y 5 unidades. Eso no existe en los números ballena, ferrocarril, pluma, caldera. No existe.
¿Por qué el perro de las 3 y 14, visto de perfil, tiene el mismo nombre que el perro de las 3 y cuarto, visto de frente?
I realized then that for all his prodigious memory, Funes was incapable of generalizing, of abstracting, that he was, in short, incapable of thought. In his teeming world there was nothing but detail after detail. It must have been difficult for him to sleep, to turn his mind from the world. Almost in fear, it occurred to me that each of my words, each of my movements would live on forever in the stammering grandeur of Funes's memory. I hardly dared move, not wishing to add to his awful burden. Toward dawn, almost as if for the first time, I saw the face of the voice that had spoken to me all night. It seemed as monumental as bronze, more ancient than Egypt, older than the prophets and the pyramids. It was almost with relief that I learned 2 years later of Funes's death from congestion of the lungs.
Därmed gott biat mer och nicht wakot nakan stefnan, då ni hebe kliv knosaf,
kalde je thrungen voron fed mine, forste je bunden kaldum klomum, nebeth him to herpan hye, na to ringveie, na to viva vina, na to world hygt. Ver, ik neje hyrde butan klima se, is kaldne way, huilum hulvete song. How does it sound?
It sounds beautiful.
Yes, I think it does, really. Of course, this is South American Anglo-Saxon, mere South American Anglo-Saxon. It sounds beautifully.
You once said that you always came to books before you came to things. You must have absorbed a whole library of literary memories.
Poetry springs from poetry. As you say that, after all, since there are many subjects, why not reading? Since reading is one of the major experiences of mankind. The reading is very important, at least to me, and also living, you know. But reading, well, when you're reading, you're living, of course, and in a very vivid way sometimes. So Montaigne said that reading was a language pleasure, but I don't believe that. I don't feel of it that way. I feel of reading as very vivid, especially if you're reading poetry.
Elvira de Alvear. She once had everything, but one by one, each thing abandoned her. We saw her armed with beauty. The morning and the hard light of noon from their pinnacle revealed to her the glorious kingdoms of the world. Evening wiped them away. The luck of the stars, the endless, ever-present web of causes.
Menos una, la generosa cortesía, la acompañó hasta el fin de su jornada, más allá del delirio y del eclipse, de un modo casi angélico. De Elvira, lo primero que vi hace tantos años fue la sonrisa, y es también lo último.
Claro, claro. Murió sonriendo, sí. Y completamente loca, quería asesinarla a la madre. Quedaron muy, muy pobres.
Madre.
¿Qué te pasó?
The lift, well, the elevator, I mean, well, it was out of order, so I climbed up a staircase, and I felt something fluttering my forehead. I thought, how strange, a bat. It was a window. And then I had, well, the blood poison, and I was operated on, and I was, well, about to die, but I never thought of that. Death is too abstract a thing, especially when you're suffering physical pain and insomnia and nightmares. So I was just so interested in my personal suffering that I never thought about being in danger.
The gray man crawled up the slippery bank without parting, perhaps without feeling the brushy thorns that tore his flesh. He made his way, faint and bleeding, to the circular ruin which was once the color of fire and is now the color of ash. This ruin was a temple which was destroyed ages ago by flames. The stranger knew it was the place he needed for his unswerving purpose, which, though it was supernatural, was not impossible. He wanted to dream a man. He wanted to dream him down to the last detail and project him into the world of reality. The stranger dreamed himself at the center of a circular amphitheater, which in some way was also the burnt-out temple. Crowds of disciples exhausted the tiers of seats. The faces of the farthest of them hung centuries away from him and at a height of the stars. The man lectured on anatomy, cosmography, and witchcraft. He was in search of a soul worthy of taking a place in the world. After 9 or 10 days, he realized that nothing could be expected from those pupils who passively accepted his teaching. He dismissed his vast dream school forever.
Borges, you speak of H.G. Wells. In what way did he influence you?
I think he taught me that a fantastic story should be accepted of the imagination. So he said that in his stories he only used one fantastic element. For example, he wrote The Invisible Man, a lonely invisible man in London. Then another, The World of the Worlds. Well, the world was invaded by people from Mars, but he didn't write a story about invisible inhabitants of Mars invading the Earth, because that would obstacle belief. So in his stories, he only had one fantastic thing, and all the rest was commonplace and unbelievable. And I have done the same thing.
He realized that the task of shaping the senseless and dizzying stuff of dreams is the hardest that a man can attempt. He realized that an initial failure was to be expected, and now he sought another method. He waited until the moon was a perfect circle. He worshipped the gods of the planets, uttered the prescribed syllables of an all-powerful name, and slept. Almost at once, he dreamed a beating heart. He dreamed it throbbing, warm, secret. With anxious love, he dreamed it for 14 lucid nights. Each night he perceived it more clearly. Before a year was over, he came to the skeleton, the eyelids. The countless strands of hair were perhaps the hardest task of all. He dreamed the whole man, a young man, but the young man could not stand up or speak, nor could he open his eyes. Night after night, the man dreamed him asleep. At last, in the dreamer's dream, the dreamed one awoke.
I was enjoying that kind of writing, that kind of pompous writing. I was enjoying it as a game. After all, literature is a game. But Stevenson said you should play at it seriously, even as a boy does. A boy plays seriously. I suppose a literary man plays seriously, but he knows that the whole thing is a play. or a game.
The magician devoted 2 years to initiating his disciple into the riddles of the universe and the worship of fire. The exercises over, he sent his son down the river to another temple. The magician knew that of all the creatures in the world, fire was the only one who would recognize his son as a phantom. The recollection tormented him. The end of these anxieties came suddenly, but certain signs foretold it. The sky took on the rosy hue of a leopard's gums. Pillars of smoke turned the metal of the nights to rust. What had happened many centuries ago was happening again. The ruins of the fire god's shrine were being destroyed by fire. Death was coming to crown the magician's years and to release him from his labors. He walked into the leaping pennants of flame. They did not bite into his flesh, but caressed him and flooded him without heat or burning. In relief, in humiliation, in terror, he understood that he too was an appearance, that someone else was dreaming him.
Le dolía fuertemente la cabeza, lo cual, sumado a un decaimiento general, lo desalentó.
When I began to recover, I feared for my mental integrity. I remember that my mother wanted to read to me from a book, but for 2 or 3 nights I kept putting her off. At last she prevailed, reading me a page or 2.
Esto le hizo notar que el cuarto, si es que estaba en un cuarto, estaba notablemente caliente. ¿Por qué llora, Georgie?
Lloro porque entiendo.
I had ordered several books from London. They came, and my mother wanted to read them aloud to me. But I wouldn't have it because I was afraid of not understanding them. And then she read me a book called Out of the Dark Planet, from the Dark Planet. A book, I think, by C. something Lewis. It's a science fiction story. Then, when she came to the 3rd or 4th page, she saw that I was crying. She said, "Why are you crying?" And then I said, "Well, because I understand what you're saying, what you're reading, and I hope to understand." I thought that I could, well, mind, well, it fallen to pieces. So the fact of understanding a novel, that was a fine experience to me. That was a month after the actual operation.
In order to convalesce from a head wound exactly like the one suffered by Borges, Juan Dalman, in the story The South, decides to go to the country to the south of Buenos Aires. In the agony of his first night in the hospital, Dalman felt that if he'd been able to choose or dream his own death, this is the death he would have chosen or dreamed. Is this his reality? Or is it his last dream on the operating table? For some reason or other, the train had been unable to stop at his station, and Dalman finds himself in a place he does not recognize.
No se vaya, señor Doc. No le hagas caso a los muchachos. Están un poco alegres.
Surprisingly, the proprietor knows his name. Dahlman feels the insult is now more than just to him. It's to his family honor.
¿Qué andan buscando ustedes?
Mírenlo al pavo de mierda. Parece un pavote. Salí a pelear si sos hombre.
Déjelo en paz, muchacho. Lo ve que está desarmado.
It was as though the South had decided that Dahlman should accept the challenge. As he picked up the knife, he felt two things. First, that this almost instinctive action bound him to fight. Second, that in his clumsy hand the weapon would not serve to defend him, but only to justify his being killed.
It's individual courage, no? Not courage for the sake of a cause or for faith. No, just individual courage, personal courage, I mean. So I suppose people have to worship things, and then why not worship courage? And that was done well by the Norsemen, I suppose, by the Saxons also. The idea of worshiping courage for its own sake, not for the sake of a cause or a sacrifice or dying for your country or dying for your faith, no.
Allusion to the death of Colonel Francisco Borges, 1833, 1874. White horse, white poncho, pick a studied way over the flat terrain. Ahead, death lurks patiently in the barrels of the guns. Colonel Borges sadly crosses the plain. What closed on him, the Remington's crackle, what his eye took in, endless grazing land, are what he saw and heard his whole life long.
After General Mitre had surrendered in one of our small civil wars, he decided, well, to commit suicide in a sense. So he rode on a white horse, he wore a white poncho, he rode very slowly, he didn't gallop, he rode very slowly with his arms crossed, then he got two Remington bullets into him, and then he fell off his horse and he died that very night. It was a kind of suicide, but he used as his weapon, let's say, a whole army. Well, De Quincey wrote about that, The Death in Summer, in his autobiography. And there you have Death in Summer, I mean, a man riding a white horse, wearing a white poncho, being shot by two Remington bullets. It was at 2 o'clock or so in the afternoon, the sunlight on him.
Here was his home, in the thick of battle. In his epic world, riding on his horse, I leave him almost untouched by my verse. There's beauty in the tombs, the spare Latin and link of fatal dates, the conjunction of marble and flowers, the broad intersections as cool as patios, and all our yesterdays of a history now stilled and unique. We mistake this peace for death, believing we yearn for our end when we yearned for sleep and oblivion. These thoughts came to me in the Recoleta, in the place where my ashes will lie. The remains of Borges's great-grandfather, Colonel Isidoro Suarez, lie mingled with those of a friend in the family tomb, among other illustrious forebears. Suarez fought for his country's independence, but was to die in exile in Montevideo.
For the rest, I suppose most of my people are here, except that I don't feel them to be here, really. What is left is, well, something fleshly, mere, simply ashes and so on. And I can't even think of a ghost as being here. And I hope my ghost will not be restricted to this rather uncanny and weird cell. Theoretically, yes, in theory I am a quiet anarchist, more or less like Herbert Spencer, and as far as war goes, I'm a pacifist now, in spite of my, well, I suppose epic grandfathers and so on. I'm a pacifist, I'm in good company. Well, I can speak of, well, Alberdi, who wrote that book, The Crime of War, during the Paraguayan War. Why not? Tolstoy, Ruskin, Bertrand Russell, Henri Barbusse, Romain Rolland, Hammarskjöld. Well, there were so many of them.
Borges sometimes says he doesn't understand his own country, that only time makes history comprehensible. During World War II, for championing the Allied cause and perhaps also for his outspoken defense of Argentine Jewry, Borges lost his job at the library. In contrast, his occasional faint praise of Argentina's military regimes during the 70s has puzzled his admirers.
Well, see, being blind, not reading the newspapers, I was very ignorant. But since then, people have come to my house and have told me sad stories about, well, the disappearance of their daughters, their wives, their children. So now I know better. Well, that's it. During the time, I know nothing whatever about it. Things were kept from me, but now those things can't be ignored. Yes, many people have accused me of, well, being rather late in the day. But what else could I do? You see, I live by myself, I know few people, I read no papers. I only heard what my friends tell me, and my friends belong, well, to a certain set. But now, of course, I know all about all that misery, all those crimes, piled one on top of the other. That's the reason why I was silent before. Ignorance, dear madam, sheer ignorance, as Dr. Johnson said. Now I think I know better. And I feel very sad about it, of course. Loving my country as I do.
Oddly, one of Borges's most complete portraits of his beloved Buenos Aires comes in his phantasmagorical tale, Death and the Compass, whose mood and texture are straight out of the pages of G.K. Chesterton. Of the many problems that ever taxed Eric Lönnrot's rash mind, none was so strange, so methodically strange, let us say, as the intermittent series of murders which came to a culmination amid the incessant odor of eucalyptus trees at the Villa Triste-le-Roi. It is true that Lönnrot failed to prevent the last of the murders, but that he foresaw it is undeniable. The first murder had taken place 3 months earlier in a hotel on the east side of the city. Its victim was Rabbi Marcel Yarmolinsky, the author of an erudite book on the Tetragrammaton, the 4 secret letters of the name of God. The second murder took place exactly 1 month after the first. This time the victim, a petty gangster, was found on the city's north side. Again, exactly 1 month later, the third murder occurred, but this time on the south side. Studying the locations of these three crimes, Lönnrot noted their symmetry in time and space. The third victim had disappeared during Carnival. On his map, Lönnrot saw that the points of the three crimes formed the sides of an equilateral triangle. All at once, he felt he was on the verge of solving the mystery. There was one shape each crime had in common. Now he knew there was going to be a fourth crime, and he knew where and when it would happen. As the story unfolds, Borges makes us wonder, is the detective Lönnrot a fool walking into a death trap? Or, in some symbolic way, is he a man committing suicide?
Quédate quieto, que te estoy apuntando. Quédate quieto, te digo.
In a short story, well, what you first see is the plot, and then you go on to the characters. As to myself, I have created no characters of any kind. I just imagine myself in different periods, in different situations. And that's that. I haven't created a single character, as far as I'm aware.
Es usted muy amable. Ha caído en mi laberinto.
The detective and the criminal, whose minds work in the same way, may be the same man. The hint is there in their names, Löhnrot and Skarlach, in German, red and scarlet.
Usted ha dado vuelta a las cosas, Skarlach. En vez del detective cazar al delincuente, parece que el delincuente atrapó al detective.
Al rabino lo mataron por error. Uno de mis hombres me traicionó. Y ese fue la segunda víctima. Conociendo su forma de pensar, le preparé un escenario para su muerte y dispuse las señales que lo condujeron aquí. A triste le roi.
La primera señal, el tetragramaton. Después las formas repetidas. El rombo en la pared de la pinturería. Los rombos en los trajes de los arlequines.
Y el triángulo equilátero, formado por las líneas que unen los puntos de los crímenes.
Sí, usted supo que yo encontraría el cuarto lugar donde se cometería el cuarto crimen.
Sí, amigo mío. Y lo encontró. Aquí. En la soledad de esta casa.
In 1955, after the fall of Perón, always referred to by Borges as the unmentionable, Borges was named director of the Argentine National Library. Poem of the Gifts. No one should read self-pity or reproach into this statement of the majesty of God, who with such splendid irony granted me books and blindness at one touch. Care of this city of books he handed over to sightless eyes, which now can do no more than read in libraries of dream the poor and senseless paragraphs that dawns deliver to wishful scrutiny.
Davis Barnard. La edición que tiene hoy está.
Barnett, sí.
In vain the day squanders on these same eyes its infinite tomes, as distant as the inaccessible volumes which perished once in Alexandria. In shadow, with a tentative stick, I try the hollow twilight, slow and imprecise. I, who had always thought of paradise, in form and image as a library.
Well, because I keep on repeating the same tricks, and people like them. I mean, I'm always amazing them, well, with mirrors, with swords, with labyrinths, with masks, and that's that. Yeah, quite a small bag of tricks.
You open one story with these lines, Borges. If I'm not mistaken, the chief sources of information concerning Mokhana, the veiled or literally masked prophet of Khorasan, are only 4 in number.
And then they invented 2 of them, no?
Those passages from the history of the caliphs culled by Baladuri, the Giant's Handbook, or Book of Precision and Revision.
Well, the whole thing was a hoax, of course. The Giant's Handbook, it's quite good. Did he actually write that?
You did, yes.
The Giant's Handbook. Why should a giant need a handbook? This was an enormous book. A very bulky volume, meant for a giant.
According to the facts, the complex revolution, the sartorial revolution that is, began at the seaside resort of Necochea. Its leading actors were Eduardo S. Bradford and police chief Manuel M. Silveira. Many will recall the elegant figure that Bradford cut. At the same time, he was so sensitive to the cold that no one ever saw him bathe in the sea. Another idiosyncrasy that did not elude the eye of the keen observer was that, in spite of the watch chain he wore across his waistcoat, Bradford mischievously refused to give anyone the time. Borges is always a consummate entertainer, a sly humorist. Sometimes the humor runs to the extravagant, and nowhere more than in the sketches written 15 years ago in collaboration with his longtime friend, Adolfo Bioy Casares. No one, perhaps, might ever have rung down the curtain on Bradford's guise had it not been for the perspicacity of Police Chief Silveira, who, spurred on by a bloodhound instinct, came to have his suspicions. The tireless sleuth ordered 2 plainclothesmen to tail Bradford to the door of his modest home on one of those still unnamed streets far out beyond the town limits. Bradford surrendered on the spot, but he did not let go of his Malacca cane, nor did he take off his hat. Accused by the prosecuting attorney of breach of trust and indecent exposure, Bradford immediately gave in. From 1923 to 1931, our hero, the impeccable gentleman of the promenade, had strolled the town of Necochea naked. Hat, mustache, collar, tie, watch chain, carnation, suit, and set of buttons were but drawings in color applied to the tabula rasa of his epidermis. About his trousers we choose to preserve silence. After the trial, Bradford, in the martyrdom of a jail cell, revealed himself as the pioneer he was. Wearing no more than a striped suit, stubbornly drawn on his flesh, he died of bronchial pneumonia.
I think he even paints a hat and an umbrella also, no? Or a stick. Yes. How that is done, nobody knows. At least I don't. Yes, I think he has a straw hat and he carries an umbrella. Yes, I went in for hoaxes, even as did Carlyle. But now, yes, I'm tired out. I try to be straightforward, to avoid being clever, to avoid being humorous. I just write on in my own way.
Borges and myself. It's to the other man, to Borges, that things happen. I walk along the streets of Buenos Aires. Of Borges I get news through the mail and glimpse his name in a dictionary of biography. I have a taste for hourglasses, maps, 18th century topography, the roots of words, the smell of coffee, and Stevenson's prose. The other man shares these likes, but in a showy way that turns them into stagey mannerisms. It would be an exaggeration to say that we're on bad terms. I let myself live, so that Borges can weave his tales and poems, and those tales and poems are my justification. And so my life is a running away, and I lose everything, and everything is left to oblivion or to the other man. Which of us is writing this page, I don't know.
Mírenlo al pavo de mierda. Parece un pavote.
Borges, ¿cómo era?
Ik ben mijn schulvum.
Usted ha dado vuelta a las cosas.
No, tranquilo, nada. Usted me está haciendo trampas.
Mi memoria, señor, es como vaciadero de basuras.
A man sets himself the task of depicting the world. Year after year, he fills a long white wall with images of provinces, kingdoms, mountains, bays, ships, islands, fishes, anchors, rooms, tools, stars, horses, and people. Just before he dies, he discovers that out of this patient labyrinth of lines emerge the features of his own face.
stand in hope of death, great hope of death. I wouldn't like to die at this very moment, but maybe tonight. No, tonight I can't. Tomorrow I have to work. Well, the day after tomorrow, that's fine. Yeah. But maybe I'm too impatient. I'll have to wait a few days, or a few weeks, or a few years.